Dear listeners, welcome to The Burning Christmas Lantern, a Miss Marple mystery that glows with secrets, shivers with suspense, and reminds us that even light can hide the darkest truths. When a forgotten pond reveals its final secret and guilt flickers brighter than flame, Miss Marple must untangle a web of silence, fear, and the ghost of a vanished Christmas lantern. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Have you ever trusted someone only to realize they were hiding the truth all along? Tell me below. I'm curious to know what you would have done if you were in Miss Marple's place. If you heard a knock at midnight, would you open the door? Tell me below. I'm dying to know how brave you really are. It was the sort of December morning that made Mary Mead look like the front of a Christmas card. Roofs dusted with powdery snow, wreaths on every door, and the faint smell of pine and mince pies drifting from open kitchen windows. The village green was adorned with a tall Christmas tree. Its branches hung with red ribbons and tiny lanterns that would be lit that evening for the annual carol service. Everyone seemed in cheerful spirits, bustling about with parcels and greetings, all except for the Reverend Clement's wife, who whispered to Mrs. Price Ridley that something most unfortunate had happened at the manor. At precisely 9:30, a shrill cry rang across the frost-bitten lanes, shattering the morning calm. It came from Mill Lane, near the gates of the long-abandoned Stokely Manor. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered Mrs. Hartnell, breathless and indignant. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, peering over his spectacles, and young Tommy Bond, whose face was pale as chalk. There, hanging from the old iron gate, was a lantern, an ornate brass one, its glass blackened by soot and fire. Inside it, faintly visible through the grime, was a charred scrap of what looked like lace. The smell of something burnt lingered in the air. Before anyone could make sense of the scene, Constable Slack came striding up, coat flapping, his mustache twitching with irritation at the gathering crowd. "Now then, what's all this?" he demanded. But when he leaned closer to the lantern, his tone shifted. "Good Lord, that's blood on the glass." By mid-morning, news had spread across Mary Mead faster than a spark in dry hay. The burning lantern, it was said, had belonged to Miss Eleanor Stokely, the reclusive heiress who had lived alone in the manor until her sudden disappearance, exactly 1 year ago, on Christmas Eve. Miss Marple heard the gossip at precisely 10 minutes past 11. While trimming holly for her hearth. Her maid, Florence, came in with wide eyes. "They're sayin' someone lit her old lantern again, ma'am." "Same one she was carryin' that night she went missin'." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. "How curious," she murmured. "The dead rarely light lanterns, Florence. But the living sometimes do, when they wish to make us remember." By afternoon, the police had cordoned off the lane. A local photographer had arrived to take pictures for the county paper, and Inspector Cray from Melchester had been called in, a brisk, no-nonsense man with a fondness for tobacco and quick conclusions. He suspected a cruel prank, perhaps staged by boys or someone hoping to revive the ghostly legend of Eleanor Stokely for mischief. But not everyone was convinced. The Reverend Clement, ever cautious, remarked over tea at the vicarage that such a thing was oddly deliberate. His wife, Griselda, said it was plainly done for attention, perhaps by that journalist fellow renting the cottage near the pond. Miss Hartnell, of course, thought it was foreign nonsense, while Colonel Melchett simply grunted that women were always getting into mysteries when there was a pot of jam to be stirred instead. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her corner with her embroidery, observed all this with her usual mild interest. Human nature, she thought, rarely invents new motives. They only reappear, dressed in a different coat. That evening, Mary Mead gathered at the parish hall for the lantern lighting ceremony, a tradition begun years ago by Miss Stokely herself, who had believed that lanterns symbolized remembrance for lost loved ones. It should have been a joyous occasion, yet an uneasy tension hung in the air. People whispered about omens, curses, and old promises made by candlelight. The hall glowed with candle sconces and red ribbons. Miss Marple, seated near the back beside Mrs. Bantry, noticed small things others missed: the way Reverend Clement's hands trembled as he lit the first lantern, the brief flicker of guilt across Mrs. Hartnell's face when the name Eleanor was mentioned, and the journalist, Mr. Paul Denning, scribbling furiously in his notebook whenever the crowd murmured. As the final lanterns were lit, a hush fell. Then came a sound faint but distinct from outside. A crack, followed by the unmistakable thud of something heavy hitting the frozen ground. Screams echoed through the hall. Inspector Cray, who had attended reluctantly to keep appearances, was the first out the door. His lantern beam cut through the snow until it fell upon a figure lying near the churchyard wall. A woman, her coat aflame at the edges, one gloved hand still clutching a small brass lantern, identical to the one found that morning. The fire was quickly smothered by snow, but it was too late. The woman was quite dead. And when they turned her face to the light, Mrs. Bantry gasped aloud. It was Mrs. Agatha Hartnell. Later, in the vicarage drawing room, the survivors sat in stunned silence as Inspector Cray took notes. The Reverend Clement muttered prayers under his breath. Mrs. Price Ridley dabbed her eyes. Mr. Denning asked endless questions, his pen scratching noisily. Miss Marple, as always, sat very still, watching. She noticed the faint scorch on the hem of Mrs. Price Ridley's skirt as though she had brushed too close to a flame. She also saw the tremor in Mr. Denning's fingers, not from shock but from excitement, and she observed the vicar's wife, Griselda, carefully avoiding everyone's gaze. When the inspector announced, "We'll take statements in the morning," everyone seemed grateful to escape the room. Everyone, that is, except Miss Marple. She remained by the hearth, eyes fixed on the flickering candle. "Eleanor Stokely vanished one Christmas Eve," she said softly. "And now another woman dies, her coat burning, her lantern in hand. I dare say," she added thoughtfully, "the two events are not as distant as one might wish." She reached for her knitting bag, tucked it neatly under her arm, and smiled faintly. After all, people seldom light lanterns unless they mean to be seen. By morning, the shock of Mrs. Hartnell's death had rippled through every cottage and lane of Merry Mead. It was all anyone could talk about at the post office, the grocer's, the vicarage, even the milkman, who usually limited himself to nods and cold one. This found himself repeating the tale of the burning lantern as if he'd seen it with his own eyes. Miss Marple's window looked out upon the green, where a knot of villagers had gathered in the bitter cold, their breath misting like smoke as they exchanged speculations. Some said it was an accident, a careless candle, a bit of old wool catching flame. Others whispered that Mrs. Hartnell had known something about Miss Stokely's disappearance and had been silenced. The more imaginative suggested that Miss Stokely's ghost had finally come to punish her tormentor. Miss Marple listened, knitting needles moving steadily in her lap. The rhythm soothed her as she considered each theory in turn. Human nature, she thought, rarely leans upon the supernatural when something far more ordinary and far more cruel will do. At 10 o'clock, Inspector Cray returned to the Manor Gate, this time with 2 constables and a photographer from the Melchester Gazette. The snow had hardened overnight, preserving the footprints left around the scene like fossilized secrets. He crouched, frowning. 2 sets of prints, he muttered, one belonging to the deceased, and another, lighter, smaller, heading away toward the hedge. He straightened and turned toward the constable. "Send for that Denning fellow. Journalist or not, he was hanging about last night like a vulture. I want his account first." Paul Denning arrived soon after, notebook in hand and an expression of calculated sympathy. He was a tall, lean man with restless eyes that missed nothing. "Terrible business, Inspector," he began. "I was in the hall when I heard the screams, ran out at once. Poor woman was already down. I tried to help, but the fire, well, it was too quick." "Did you see anyone else outside?" Cray asked sharply. Denning hesitated. "It's difficult to say. There were shadows moving near the yews, perhaps someone running, but it was dark, and the snow reflected the lantern light. Could have been nothing." Miss Marple, who had wandered near under the pretext of bringing a parcel of scones for the constables, paused at those words. "Shadows near the yews," she repeated silently. "How very peculiar." The yews bordered the Stokely property, long disused except for the gardener's shed, locked these past years. "Thank you, Mr. Denning," said the inspector curtly. "You'll remain in the village until further notice." That afternoon, at the vicarage, the Reverend and his wife held what was tactfully called a comforting tea. The entire village seemed to attend. There was solemn talk of Providence, of tragic accidents, and the mysteries of fate. But beneath it all ran the quicksilver hum of gossip, the kind that thrives when fear and curiosity mingle. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to speak too loudly. "I told her not to meddle with that old business," she declared, eyes darting around. Mrs. Hartnell fancied herself a sleuth, asking questions about poor Miss Stokely. She even went up to the manor last week, poking about the gatehouse like a busybody. "Oh, really?" murmured Miss Marple gently, pouring more tea. "And what was she looking for, I wonder?" Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. "Something about a missing brooch. Said it had sentimental value. Foolish of her. People should let the dead rest." The room murmured assent, though several looked unconvinced. Miss Marple smiled faintly, watching as the vicar's wife refilled cups with trembling hands. Griselda was usually calm, unflappable, but today her gaze kept flitting toward the window. "You seem troubled, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. Griselda started. "Oh, just the cold, I think. Such a dreadful night. I can't get the image out of my head." She forced a smile, then rose to fetch more sandwiches. Miss Marple's blue eyes followed her. She had noticed something small. Something everyone else had overlooked, the faint scent of paraffin lingering on Griselda's glove when she had poured the tea. Most would dismiss it as coincidence, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust coincidence. As twilight fell, the church bell tolled softly across the snowbound village. Inspector Cray made his way to the vicarage once more. Hat pulled low. He greeted Miss Marple with a gruff nod. "Evenin', ma'am. Thought I'd best tell you myself. The labs confirmed the lanterns were soaked in oil. Not candlelight that set her off. Someone poured paraffin and lit it." "How dreadful," said Miss Marple, her tone mild. "A deliberate fire, then?" "Looks that way. And another thing, Mrs. Hartnell's coat pockets were empty, except for a torn handkerchief with the initials E. S. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Eleanor Stokely. Just so. Could be a plant, could be something she found, but why would she have it on her after all this time?" Miss Marple glanced toward the churchyard, where the last lanterns of the evening flickered in the snow. "Perhaps," she said softly, "because she finally learned what really happened that night, and someone else learned that she knew." Cray frowned, perplexed. "You think this ties back to Stokely's disappearance?" "I think, Inspector," she said, folding her hands neatly in her lap, "that in villages like ours, sins do not vanish. They simply wait patiently for Christmas." He looked at her, half amused, half respectful. "You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple," she smiled. "One learns. With time." When he left, she remained seated, gazing out into the dark where the snow fell in steady silence. A single lantern still burned by the gate of Stokely Manor, its flame steady despite the wind. And as Miss Marple watched, it seemed to her not imagination, surely, that a figure moved just beyond its glow. Watching in turn, the knitting lay forgotten on her lap. Somewhere behind those cold windows, she felt, lay the answer to both deaths. One from a year ago, one from last night. And perhaps, before the next Christmas dawned, there would be yet another if she did not act swiftly. For in merry mead, she thought, every lantern hides its own small flame, and some are lit for vengeance. The following morning dawned gray and heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the hedgerows and made the church spire look ghostly above the roofs. The air carried a strange hush, as though the entire village were holding its breath. At precisely 8 o'clock, Miss Marple set out for her walk. Scarf knotted neatly, and a small basket in hand, a harmless figure to anyone watching. But her mind was already fixed upon Stokely Manor and the unanswered questions that lay within its walls. The constable posted at the gate tipped his cap as she approached. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple. Inspector's not allowing visitors inside just now." "Oh, I shouldn't dream of intruding," she replied pleasantly. "I only thought to bring a little tea and scones for you dear men out here in the cold. You know, my nephew Raymond always says there's nothing like food to make one see things more clearly." The constable, disarmed by her warmth, thanked her gratefully. While he poured tea, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the ground. The footprints she had noted yesterday were still there, two distinct sets, one heavier and one lighter. But now she saw something the inspector's men had missed. A third set, faint and half covered by drifted snow, leading from the hedge toward the back of the manor where the gardener's shed stood locked. Curious, she murmured to herself. 3 sets, not 2. She returned to her cottage just as Inspector Cray arrived, his coat flecked with frost and his face drawn from lack of sleep. "Morning, Miss Marple. We've identified that handkerchief-embroidered initials match items from Miss Stokely's old dressing table." The family solicitor confirmed it. "How very interesting," she said quietly. "So poor Mrs. Hartnell was in possession of something once belonging to the late Miss Stokely. I wonder how she came by it." "That's the puzzle," Cray admitted. "I've checked her house, no sign of the missing brooch she was searching for, nor any letters or notes about Stokely. But she did have a torn page from a parish ledger. Something about Christmas Eve of last year. I'm waiting for the vicar to explain it." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "A ledger, you say? How odd that it should concern the very night Eleanor vanished. Perhaps you might show me?" Cray hesitated but finally nodded. "You seem to have a knack for noticing what others miss. Just don't go spreading tales to the villagers." At the vicarage, the Reverend Clement looked troubled as he handed over the remaining ledger. "It's nothing remarkable," he said. "Simply a record of the charity funds distributed last Christmas food parcels. Small donations. Though there was some confusion about one family, the Stokeles's old maid, Martha Briggs. Her name was crossed out, as I recall." Miss Marple studied the neat script. The line where Martha Briggs' name appeared had indeed been struck through with heavy ink. "And did anyone ever inquire why?" The Reverend blinked. "No, I can't say they did. She left the village shortly after Miss Stokely's disappearance. Went north, I believe." "How convenient," murmured Miss Marple. "A servant vanishes just when her mistress does, and no one troubles to ask why." Griselda entered then, pale and quiet. She carried a small bundle of letters, which she handed to her husband. "These arrived this morning. One is addressed to the late Mrs. Hartnell. No return name, but the handwriting seems familiar somehow." Miss Marple glanced at it, her sharp eyes narrowing. The writing was firm and elegant, the sort used by educated women who took pride in their penmanship. "Might I?" she asked softly. The vicar nodded. She unfolded the letter carefully. Inside were only 3 words, written in blue ink. "You lit the wrong lantern." The silence in the room was almost tangible. Cray muttered an oath under his breath. Some kind of threat, then. Or a warning. Either way, it means someone knew she'd die that night. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the paper. Or someone meant her to die instead of another. Cray looked up sharply. "You think she wasn't the intended victim?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Mrs. Hartnell stumbled upon something meant for someone else entirely. Perhaps she was never meant to light her own lantern that night, but someone's." The inspector rubbed his jaw, considering. "Then who was supposed to?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the window, where the churchyard lanterns still stood dimly against the snow. "The message says, 'Wrong lantern, not wrong woman. Whoever wrote it believes the signal went astray. A mistake, perhaps, but one that cost a life.'" She rose then, gathering her shawl about her shoulders. "I think I shall pay a little visit to the old Stokely gardener's shed. It's curious, isn't it? How forgotten places often hold the memories others would rather stay buried." Cray frowned, but made no move to stop her. "Just be careful, Miss Marple. Whoever we're dealing with may not take kindly to prying." She gave him her most innocent smile. "Oh, my dear Inspector, people rarely notice an old lady with her knitting bag." As she stepped out into the cold, the snow began to fall again, soft, relentless, and strangely muffling, as though the village itself wished to hide its whispers beneath a white silence. Miss Marple's steps left neat prints leading toward Stokely Manor, her mind turning over the facts like cards in a patient game: the missing maid, the wrong lantern, and the woman who had known too much. There was a pattern forming now, faint but undeniable. Somewhere in Merry Mead, she thought, someone was watching for a signal that had already been given and waiting to see who would answer it. Miss Marple reached the grounds of Stokely Manor just as the church clock struck noon. its slow chimes echoing through the mist. The gate creaked faintly when she pushed it open, and the crunch of snow beneath her sensible shoes sounded unusually loud in the stillness. The manor loomed ahead, a grand yet weary structure. Its shutters closed like heavy eyelids guarding old secrets. Somewhere in the orchard beyond, a crow cawed once, the sound hollow and unsettling. She moved toward the gardener's shed, tucked behind a row of yews that had grown wild since the estate was abandoned. The lock on the door was new, shiny against the rusted hinges. That alone was peculiar enough to draw her attention. She bent to examine it closely, gloved fingers brushing against faint black marks on the wood paraffin residue. Someone had lit a lantern here recently. Her thoughts moved swiftly, quietly. A locked shed, new padlock. Recent flame, it suggested concealment, not neglect. She straightened, scanning the ground, and noticed a faint trail of footprints leading away toward the frozen pond. 2 sets again, one smaller than the other. The smaller prints ended abruptly by the edge, where the ice was faintly cracked. She crouched, peering closer, and noticed a thin strand of thread snagged on a bramble-red silk, the same shade as the ribbons used on the Christmas lanterns. "How odd," she murmured. "The wrong lantern, a red thread, and a woman dead by fire. We are circling back to the same hands." Her reflection trembled on the pond's cloudy surface as she rose, brushing the snow from her coat. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn sharply. It was Inspector Cray, puffing clouds of breath in the cold. "You just can't keep away, can you, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, I was merely taking a little air. I find one's mind clears beautifully near frozen water." He gave her a look that was half amusement, half warning. "I've been to Melchester. Found Martha Briggs, the maid who left after Miss Stokely vanished. She's living with her sister now. Says she'll come tomorrow to make a statement." "That's good news," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Sometimes those who leave a place remember more clearly than those who remain." Cray lit his pipe, cupping the flame. "She told me one thing already. Said Miss Stokely had a visitor on the night she disappeared, a woman, not a man. Arrived after dusk, carrying a lantern. She didn't see her face clearly." Miss Marple's knitting fingers would have paused at such a revelation had she been holding yarn. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the shed again. "A woman with a lantern," she repeated softly. "Perhaps that's where the confusion began. Someone mistook one woman for another." Cray frowned. Meaning, she said gently, "that Mrs. Hartnell might not have been the first to light the wrong lantern." The inspector exhaled, troubled. "We'll find out soon enough. I'm arranging a search of the shed tomorrow morning. Too dark to bother with today." Miss Marple nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the shed. Darkness is often when things are placed where we least expect them. As Cray departed, she lingered a few minutes longer, listening. There was a faint sound, perhaps a door closing softly, perhaps the shifting of wind through old eaves. Then silence again, dense and patient. She finally turned and began her slow walk back toward the village, each step measured and thoughtful. The vicarage lamps were already burning when she arrived. Griselda opened the door, her expression strained but relieved. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness. The inspector said you'd gone to the manor. I feared you'd catch your death out there." "Dear me, no," Miss Marple said mildly, unwrapping her scarf. "The cold sharpens the mind. It's quite bracing." She accepted the tea offered and sat by the hearth. "Has there been any word since I left?" Griselda hesitated. "Only something rather strange. The vicar found a lantern on the church steps this afternoon, burnt out, with the same red ribbon tied to it." "Indeed." Miss Marple's tone was calm, though her eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "And who discovered it?" "A child, delivering milk. He said it wasn't there at morning service." "Then it was placed there deliberately," Miss Marple said softly. "A message of sorts. Perhaps meant for the vicar. Or perhaps merely to remind us that the game continues." Griselda shivered. "You make it sound like a warning." Miss Marple looked into the fire. "Warnings are rarely for those who heed them. They are for those who refuse to see." Later, when she returned to her cottage, she found an envelope slid under her door. The writing was neat and firm, the same hand that had written the message to Mrs. Hartnell. Inside was a single sheet bearing only one phrase: "The light returns at midnight." For a moment she stood very still, the note trembling slightly between her fingers. Outside, snow fell in soft, deliberate flakes. Somewhere, a clock began to strike the quarter hour. Miss Marple set the letter down beside her, knitting, and murmured, "Then someone intends to light another lantern tonight." She went to the window and looked out towards Stokely Manor, its silhouette barely visible through the falling snow. Somewhere in that frozen quiet, a secret waited for its final illumination, and she intended to be there when the light returned. The evening deepened with a quiet that seemed almost deliberate, the kind of stillness that presses upon the senses and makes even the smallest sound feel amplified. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting untouched on her lap, her eyes fixed on the distant outline of Stokely Manor. The note lay on the table beside her, its words stark against the pale paper. "The light returns at midnight." The church clock struck 10. Outside, the snow muffled all movement. Only the faint rustle of branches broke the silence. Miss Marple's thoughts turned methodically, as they always did when danger began to take form. Midnight, a returning light. Someone was planning to recreate the event that had started it all, perhaps to signal, or perhaps to silence once more. Either way, she intended to be present. At 10:30, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Inspector Cray stood there, collar turned up, his breath a cloud in the frigid air. "I've just come from the station," he said grimly. "We intercepted another letter posted this morning in Melchester, addressed to the vicar. Same handwriting. It said, 'Forgiveness burns brighter than truth.' I don't like the sound of it." Miss Marple took the paper, scanning it carefully. Indeed, the same hand, the same curious phrasing. Whoever writes these believes themselves justified. Cray nodded. "I've doubled the watch around the manor and the church. If there's to be another meeting or prank tonight, we'll be ready." She studied him quietly. "Inspector, may I suggest a small change? Place one man at the gardener's shed, and another by the pond. If I'm correct, that's where our next light will appear." He frowned. "You're basing that on intuition?" "On experience," she said mildly. "Human beings repeat their mistakes, particularly when they believe those mistakes went unnoticed the first time." Cray hesitated, then sighed. "Very well, but I'd prefer you stay indoors tonight, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "And miss the conclusion of our little drama?" "Oh, no, Inspector. I assure you, I shall keep well out of your way." By 11, the village lay in complete darkness, save for the faint glow from a few hearths. Miss Marple wrapped herself in a heavy shawl and slipped quietly through the garden gate, her steps careful on the snow-packed lane. The moon had risen pale and uncertain behind the clouds, giving the world a washed-out, spectral glow. She reached the edge of the manor grounds just as the church bell marked the half-hour. Ahead, faint lantern light flickered near the pond, low and rhythmic, as though signaling. Miss Marple drew closer, keeping to the shadows. She could see now that someone stood by the water's edge, cloaked and hooded, holding a lantern aloft. Its red ribbon fluttered slightly in the wind. Then, from the direction of the shed, another lantern flickered in answer just for a moment. She took a cautious step forward and a branch cracked beneath her boot. The figure by the pond turned sharply, startled, and for an instant the lantern light illuminated their face. It was Griselda Clement. Before Miss Marple could speak, another figure lunged from the darkness, a man this time, and snatched at the lantern. There was a brief struggle, a cry, and then the lantern fell into the snow, its flame extinguished with a hiss. The man fled toward the hedge. Inspector Cray burst from the shadows, pistol raised, shouting for his men. Lanterns flared all around as constables rushed forward. "Hold your fire!" he bellowed. "No one moves until we see who's here." Griselda, pale and trembling, clutched Miss Marple's arm. I thought it was the vicar," she stammered. "He asked me to bring the lantern to the pond. He said we were to pray for Eleanor." Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "No, my dear. The vicar is at home, sound asleep. Someone sent you that message knowing you would obey." The inspector knelt to retrieve the fallen lantern. Inside its glass, half melted by heat, lay a folded photograph. When he pried it free, he swore softly. Good Lord. It's Miss Stokely with Mrs. Hartnell and another woman. Martha Briggs. Miss Marple peered closer. Taken before Christmas last year, I should think. See the ribbons, they match those used at the lantern ceremony. She turned to Cray. This isn't about murder for greed, Inspector. It's guilt. Someone has been trying to atone for what happened that night, only to find the past burns hotter than forgiveness. Cray rose, shaking his head. Then who attacked Mrs. Hartnell? Who set these fires? Miss Marple looked toward the hedge where the attacker had vanished. Someone who believed Mrs. Hartnell betrayed their secret, and now, perhaps, believes Mrs. Clement has done the same. The inspector signaled to his men to search the grounds, but the night had swallowed all trace of the intruder. Miss Marple guided Griselda gently back toward the path, her tone kind but measured. You mustn't blame yourself, my dear. You were merely the next lantern in a chain that should have been broken long ago. As they passed the churchyard, the last of the snow began to fall again, blanketing the footprints, the pond, and the shed in one cold, merciful silence. Yet Miss Marple knew the quiet was temporary. The truth, once set alight, could never truly be extinguished, and by dawn, she would have enough pieces to name the one who had struck the match. The following morning dawned with a thin, pale sun that offered little warmth. The events of the night had left the entire village shaken. Whispers moved like smoke through the lanes. Mrs. Clement seen by the pond. The mysterious struggle, the shadowed figure who had escaped into the hedge. Miss Marple, however, did not join the gossip. She sat at her kitchen table, a pot of tea growing cold beside her. The previous night's letter spread open before her. The light returns at midnight. It was not merely a warning, it was a promise fulfilled. Someone had indeed returned to finish what began a year ago. And she now felt certain of one thing. The heart of the matter was not vengeance, but guilt. At 9 o'clock, Inspector Cray arrived again, looking as though he had not slept at all. We've searched the grounds till dawn, he said wearily, removing his hat. No sign of the man who attacked her, but the footprints 2 sets again. Same pattern as before. One heavy, one light. Whoever he is, he's clever. Doubled back through the orchard and out toward the old railway line. Miss Marple looked up, her expression thoughtful. Cleverness often disguises fear, Inspector, and fear can be traced more easily than malice. Cray grunted, rubbing his temples. You've got a way of making riddles sound like sense, Miss Marple, but I'll admit, I'm out of my depth. This business with the lanterns, it's like chasing shadows. Shadows tell the truth of light, she replied gently. We must look for the person whose light is bound to that first night, the one who was meant to light the lantern in Eleanor Stokely's stead. Cray frowned. You're suggesting someone else was supposed to meet her? Not Mrs. Hartnell. Not Griselda. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window where frost patterned the glass. Not them, but someone whose guilt has burned quietly ever since. A woman's hand, delicate yet determined, sent those letters. Someone who feared exposure more than discovery. The inspector blinked. A woman? Then who? Before she could answer, a knock rattled the door. It was Florence, Miss Marple's maid, breathless and flustered. Beg pardon, ma'am, but there's someone at the vicarage asking for you, a Miss Martha Briggs. Says you'll want to hear what she's got to say. Within 20 minutes, Miss Marple and Cray were seated in the vicarage drawing room opposite a stout, careworn woman in a faded shawl, her hands twisted in her lap as she spoke. I didn't mean to bring trouble, I swear it. But after I heard about Mrs. Hartnell and them lanterns again, I couldn't stay quiet no more. Cray leaned forward. Go on, Miss Briggs. The woman's eyes darted between them. That night, Christmas Eve, it wasn't no disappearance like folks said. Miss Stokely met someone by the pond. I saw him through the window while I was polishing silver. I wasn't meant to be there. See, but I'd forgot my scarf. The woman she met was Mrs. Clement. The silence that followed was absolute. Cray exhaled slowly. You're sure of that? As sure as I'm sitting here. They was quarreling, Voices raised. Miss Stokely had a letter in her hand. Said something about the truth must come out. Mrs. Clement was crying, begging her to keep quiet. Said it would ruin her husband if folk knew. Then there was a shout and the lantern dropped. Next I saw, flames were catching on her shawl. I ran for water, but by the time I came back, the pond was broke and she was gone. Miss Marple's eyes softened. So the fire wasn't meant to kill, only to frighten. But in panic, Miss Stokely fell, and Mrs. Clement believed she had caused her death. Martha nodded miserably. She made me swear never to tell. Said it'd destroy the vicar's name, and she'd make it right somehow. But last year, when that journalist came sniffing about, and Mrs. Hartnell started talking of brooches and ghosts, I knew it couldn't stay buried. Inspector Cray rose, jaw tight. Then last night someone tried to stop her from confessing. The same person who's been sending those cursed letters. But if Mrs. Clement didn't write them— She didn't, said Miss Marple quietly. But she received them. Someone else has been pulling the strings, keeping the fear alive, perhaps the same person who stood to gain from Eleanor Stokely's silence. Cray looked puzzled. Gain how? Miss Marple picked up the ledger still resting on the vicar's desk. Through charity, Inspector. The misappropriated funds from last Christmas. I believe Miss Stokely discovered that the parish money was being used for private debts. When she threatened to reveal it, she vanished. Mrs. Clement's guilt made her the perfect scapegoat and the perfect victim for blackmail. The inspector's brow furrowed as the realization took hold. Then the blackmailer is the journalist, Mr. Denning. Miss Marple finished softly. He came to Mary Mead under the pretext of writing a story, but his interest in the Stokely case was far too keen, his questions far too precise. He must have found one of Mrs. Clement's old letters and realized what it implied. Since then, he's been tormenting her, using the lanterns as a cruel reminder. Cray slammed his fist against the desk. By heaven, I'll have him in cuffs before dusk. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector. Let him light his final lantern. I dare say tonight he will, believing no one is watching. And when he does, we shall be waiting. She turned toward the window once more, where the weak sunlight flickered across the snow, pale as ghosts. The light always returns, she murmured. But this time, it will not burn for guilt, it will burn for truth. That evening descended upon Mary Mead like a breath held too long. The snow had stopped, leaving a faint silver mist curling over the fields, and every lantern in the village seemed to flicker with watchful purpose. Miss Marple sat near her hearth, shawl drawn close, as she watched the clock edge toward 9. The plan was simple. Inspector Cray and 2 constables would take position near the churchyard, while she, under the guise of her usual evening walk, would pass along the lane by Stokely Manor. If her deductions were right, the blackmailer would come to light his final lantern, certain of his triumph. By 9:30, the air was sharp and still. Miss Marple moved with quiet deliberation, her boots making the faintest crunch upon the snow. The manor loomed ahead, windows dark, the pond a mirror of dull glass. Near the gate, she saw the faint glimmer of a lantern's glow, steady, purposeful. A figure bent over the flame, shielding it from the wind. She watched, heart steady, as the man straightened and lifted the lantern high. His features caught the light for one clear second. It was Paul Denning. He stood alone, scanning the shadows, as if expecting someone to appear. His breath rose in pale clouds. Then he spoke softly to the darkness, his voice trembling but triumphant. She'll see it tonight. She'll know what I've done. The truth will out, just not the one they wanted. Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone mild but firm. The truth, Mr. Denning, has a way of finding its own light, though I rather think yours burns too cruelly for comfort. He started, nearly dropping the lantern. You shouldn't be here, Miss Marple. Oh, I quite agree. But since you've gone to such trouble to reenact the scene, it seemed only polite to attend. She moved closer, her gaze unwavering. You used Mrs. Clement's guilt to your advantage. Each letter, each lantern, designed to keep her terrified and silent. And when Mrs. Hartnell began to pry, You made certain she wouldn't reveal your story before you could sell it. Denning's face twisted, the false charm stripped away. You don't understand. I was giving the truth a voice. They let Stokely die, lied about it, buried it like a sin. Why shouldn't the world know? Because, Miss Marple said softly, truth without mercy is only another form of cruelty. From the misted hedgerow came the crunch of boots. Inspector Cray and his men, emerging like ghosts through the mist. Denning turned, panic flaring, but the inspector's voice cut through the night. That's far enough. You're under arrest for extortion and the murder of Agatha Hartnell. Denning's defiance faltered. The lantern slipped from his grasp, falling into the snow, the flame guttering out with a faint hiss. He looked suddenly small, the bravado gone. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he muttered. She grabbed me, the fire caught, she screamed, and I ran. Miss Marple watched as the constables led him away. His shoulders bowed beneath the weight of his own schemes. The inspector approached her, shaking his head. You were right from the start. Lanterns, letters, guilt, it all led back to one greedy man. Not greed alone, she said quietly. Loneliness, resentment, the need to make himself important. A sad, common story. Cray exhaled into the cold air. You're a wonder, Miss Marple. I'd have chased my tail for weeks. She smiled faintly, eyes on the extinguished lantern. Oh, I doubt that, Inspector. But it's kind of you to say so. Now, she added, turning toward the village, let us go home. Christmas shouldn't end in darkness, don't you think? And as they walked back through the snow, the church bell tolled midnight, a soft, solemn chime, and the last lantern of Mary Mead flickered out at last. The following day broke with a soft drizzle that melted the last of the snow, turning the village lanes into narrow streams that reflected a dull gray sky. Mary Mead seemed quieter than usual, as though exhausted by the drama that had consumed it. Curtains were drawn late, doors opened cautiously, and conversation at the grocer's was held in hushed tones. Word of Paul Denning's arrest had spread quickly, yet there was an uneasy air that lingered, something unfinished, something still unspoken. Inspector Cray called at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, looking both relieved and troubled. He's confessed, he said, sinking into the armchair she indicated. Admitted to blackmail and to causing Mrs. Hartnell's death by accident. Claims he never meant to harm her. Says she fell into the fire while they struggled over that blasted lantern. We'll confirm the details soon enough. Miss Marple poured him tea, her movements calm, deliberate. People rarely mean to cause the worst things they do, Inspector, she said softly. But intent doesn't undo consequence. Cray nodded grimly. There's one more thing. He insists he found that old handkerchief by the pond last week. Says it was already there, half frozen in the ice. Thought it'd make a good prop for his story. Miss Marple paused, teacup halfway to her lips. Already there. How very peculiar. Because if it truly belonged to Miss Stokely, and was lost on the night she vanished, her voice trailed off as her mind turned over the implication. Then perhaps her story isn't quite finished either. Cray frowned. You think her body might still be out there? I think, Miss Marple said quietly, setting her cup down, that Paul Denning stumbled upon a trace of truth far greater than he ever realized. By afternoon, they were at the manor once more. The drizzle had deepened to mist, and the pond lay slick and dark beneath a ring of blackened reeds. Constables stood ready as Cray directed them to dredge the shallows. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her expression unreadable. The faint rippling of water was the only sound until one of the men called out sharply. Something pale had surfaced near the broken ice. It was a small shape, no larger than a scarf bundle at first glance, but when lifted, it revealed a skeletonized hand still clutching a strip of scorched fabric, the remains of a red ribbon. The constable crossed himself, and even the inspector's voice dropped low. Good Lord! So she was here all along. Miss Marple nodded once. The pond was frozen that night. When she fell, the ice gave way beneath her, and the water took her silently. The thaw would have hidden every trace by morning. Cray stared down at the murky water. So Mrs. Clement wasn't mad after all. She really thought she'd killed her, and that guilt, Miss Marple said softly, became the root of every tragedy that followed. Fear and remorse, such heavy chains, Inspector. They bind tighter than any rope. He turned to her, almost gently now. "How do you do it, Miss Marple? How do you look at all this death and still sound so calm?" She gave a faint, wistful smile. "Because death, my dear inspector, is only the end of action, not of consequence. In a village like ours, where hearts are small and memories long, even a single lantern can burn for years." They stood in silence as the constables carried the fragile remains toward the waiting van. Somewhere behind them, the church bell began to toll slow, steady, mournful. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter, her breath visible in the cold mist. "Let her rest now," she whispered. "At last, the light has gone where it was meant to." Evening settled over Merry Mead with an air of uneasy peace. The discovery at the pond had silenced the last of the whispers. There was nothing left to speculate now, only a hollow sorrow that seemed to hang above the rooftops like fog. In the vicarage, candles burned low as the Reverend and his wife sat together in wordless grief. Miss Marple, ever discreet, had declined to stay for supper, though Griselda had pressed her to. "You've been such a comfort, Jane," she'd said, voice trembling. "But I don't know how we'll face the congregation on Sunday." Miss Marple had smiled gently. "You will, my dear. The living must always return to their proper rhythm. The dead, well, they rest easier when the truth has been spoken." She left them then, her figure small against the dark lane, her steps steady as the church bells marked 7. The drizzle had turned to a fine mist that clung to her hair and shawl as she walked, yet her mind was not entirely at ease. Though the case seemed concluded, she could not shake one small detail that gnawed quietly at the edges of her thoughts: the handkerchief. Paul Denning had said he found it by chance, frozen into the ice. But something in his phrasing had felt rehearsed, too deliberate, as though he'd meant to plant the idea rather than reveal it. She had learned long ago that truth, when spoken in guilt, often wore the clothes of convenience. At the gate of Stokely Manor, she paused. The constables had long gone. Only the faint outline of the trampled snow and a few broken reeds remained. She moved closer, peering through the mist at the pond's edge. The water was still, black as ink, but something faint caught the corner of her eye, a glint near the old gardener's shed. She approached slowly, each step deliberate. The padlock she had noticed before was gone, the door slightly ajar. She pushed it open, half expecting the stale smell of disuse. Yet what greeted her was the faintest trace of tobacco smoke, fresh, unmistakable. And on the workbench, beside an overturned lantern, lay a small silver lighter engraved with initials E.S. Her breath caught. Miss Eleanor Stokely. But the metal was clean, gleaming, as though polished recently. Someone had placed it there not a year ago, but days, perhaps hours. A sudden sound behind her made her turn sharply. Inspector Cray stood in the doorway, his expression tense. "I might have guessed you'd come back here," he said. "You've found something, haven't you?" Miss Marple held up the lighter. "Tell me, Inspector, was this recovered when they searched the pond?" He shook his head. "No, it wasn't there before." "Then someone wished us to believe Miss Stokely still haunts this place," she said softly. "Someone who wanted the legend to linger, perhaps to distract from their own guilt." Cray frowned. "But Denning's already confessed." "Who else would?" "Someone who feared what Denning might yet reveal," Miss Marple interrupted. "His story was half truth, half invention. But there's always another hand guiding such men, someone with more to lose." The inspector looked at her sharply. "You mean—" "I mean," she said, folding her hands, "that Miss Stokely's death may have been accidental, but her money was not lost with her. Someone continued to draw from her accounts for months afterward, and whoever placed this lighter wished to keep us looking backward while they quietly profited." Cray's jaw tightened. "Then the lanterns weren't just a game?" "No," Miss Marple said, her voice low and certain. "They were smoke to hide the fire still burning. And outside, as if to echo her words, the last lantern on the manor gate flickered once more, then went out. The next morning brought a crispness to the air, a clarity that made every sound sharper and every shadow more defined." Miss Marple walked the village lanes with the calm composure of someone who knew the tide of human affairs better than most. She carried with her a small notebook, in which she had recorded each observation, each peculiarity from the events of the past fortnight. The lanterns, the letters, the accidents that were not quite accidents all formed a pattern now. One she had been piecing together quietly in her mind. Inspector Cray awaited her at the vicarage, already pacing with the restless energy that came from too many sleepless nights. "Miss Marple," he said, "I confess, I don't know how you do it. Each time I think the case is settled, you've seen a thread I never even suspected." She smiled faintly. "Inspector, threads are never hidden, only overlooked. Human nature is predictable if you know where to look. Fear, guilt, and desire, they reveal themselves in the smallest gestures." He gestured toward the garden beyond the vicarage. "Well, I've asked Mrs. Clement to meet us. She wishes to speak about the lighter and the final lantern. Perhaps it's time we draw the story to its conclusion." Griselda Clement arrived quietly, shawl drawn tight, her eyes betraying the anxiety she tried to conceal. Miss Marple greeted her gently. "You've done what you could, my dear, to carry a burden not yours to bear. But now, I think it is time we understand who truly sought to exploit it." Griselda swallowed, nodding. "I suppose it's time someone knew everything. I only followed instructions from Mr. Denning's letters. I thought I was helping someone confess, but I see now I was being manipulated." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "The letters were his work. He sought to frighten and control you, using your sense of duty against you. But there is another piece of this puzzle: the missing funds, and the hand that placed the lighter to mislead us." Cray leaned forward. "You believe someone else profited while we chased ghosts?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady, piercing. "Yes," Denning confessed to the harassment, but he did not obtain the fortune. Someone else had been quietly taking advantage of the confusion. A person close enough to Stokely Manor to know its secrets, yet distant enough to remain unseen. Griselda trembled. Who could it be? Miss Marple turned to the inspector. "Ask for the account books from the estate's solicitor. Look for discrepancies between the official records and payments over the past year. You will find the hand that lit the wrong lantern, and the hand that kept the truth buried. Denning may have caused panic, but he was only a puppet. The real culprit sought something far more substantial." Cray's eyes widened as the realization sank in. "You mean the scheme went beyond letters and lanterns? It's embezzlement as well as blackmail?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "Fear and superstition were the tools. The fires and the letters directed attention elsewhere while the fortune quietly disappeared. Now that Denning is removed, and the evidence has emerged, the perpetrator will be revealed with nothing to hide behind." Griselda exhaled slowly, relief mingled with lingering dread. "Then at last the village can rest?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle. "Rest, yes, but remember, human nature always leaves a trace. In Merry Mead, one must watch for the quiet movements as carefully as the loud ones. Tonight, the light returns not for fear, but for truth." The inspector glanced at her with admiration. "I suppose I shall leave the final step to you, Miss Marple. You always see the pieces before they appear on the board." She smiled faintly, eyes drawn once more to the window where the faint glow of the manor lanterns would soon be gone forever. "And now," she said, "we shall let justice take its course, guided not by flames or letters, but by the unerring light of reason." The solicitor's records arrived that same afternoon, delivered by a clerk who looked rather pale when he realized what the parcel contained. Inspector Cray met Miss Marple in the drawing-room of the vicarage, where the fireplace crackled gently and a tea-tray sat untouched between them. Outside, the mist had lifted, and the manor, half seen in the distance, looked less spectral and more forgotten, a house that had finally exhaled its secrets. Cray spread the ledgers on the table, his brow already furrowed. "Now, let's see what ghosts hide in numbers." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her expression calm but keen. "You'll want to begin with transactions made after Miss Stokely's disappearance, particularly those involving the maintenance of the estate. They worked in quiet concentration. Within minutes, it became clear payments had been authorized posthumously in Eleanor Stokely's name. Routine upkeep, wages for non-existent staff, and 3 sizable withdrawals labeled charitable outreach. The signatures, when compared to Miss Stokely's known correspondence, were carefully forged. Cray leaned back, whistling softly. Whoever did this was meticulous. The withdrawals were spaced out just enough to avoid suspicion. Miss Marple pointed delicately to a notation. That payment listed under clerical assistance. It's dated just 1 week after Miss Stokely vanished. Cray scanned it. Paid to Henry L. Petherick. The village solicitor? Miss Marple nodded, unblinking. A man of impeccable manners and entirely too much access. It would not be difficult for Mr. Fire Descent, Petherick, to obscure activity within his own records, especially if no one thought to question his authority over the estate's affairs. And the lighter? Cray asked, his tone hardening. He must have placed it in the shed to keep the myth alive. Let Denning's antics do the rest while he quietly siphoned funds. Exactly, Miss Marple said softly. Denning was a noisy distraction, but Mr. Petherick, he relied on subtlety. His crime was not rage, but calculation. He needed Eleanor gone, or at least permanently silent. When fate handed him her accidental death, he crafted a legend around it, then exploited the shadow it cast. The inspector stood, jaw tight. And now that shadow ends. I'll have him brought in by evening. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Speak with the bank as well. You'll find a secondary account in his name, I'm sure cleverly masked, perhaps under a relative's identity. But the numbers never lie. Inspector. As Cray gathered the documents, the church bell struck 4, solemn and echoing. The long December day was nearing its end, and with it, the long night that had blanketed Mary Mead for a year. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and exhaled softly. Not all crimes cry out in violence, Inspector. Some are whispered, penned with careful hands, and carried out over tea and ledgers. But they always leave a mark, even if it takes a lantern to illuminate it. Cray looked at her with quiet awe. Remind me never to underestimate a village spinster again. She gave him a polite smile. Oh, but Inspector, we've all been young once. It's just that some of us never stopped paying attention. Evening fell quietly over Mary Mead. The village lit not by lanterns, but by the gentle golden glow of hearth fires and lamplight. It had been a long day, the kind that left even the most talkative villagers subdued. Yet in the drawing room of the vicarage, the atmosphere was far from restful. The Reverend Clement sat beside his wife, holding her hand with the quiet strength of a man who had seen his faith tested and weathered the storm. Across from them, Miss Marple sat with her usual composure, her shawl tucked neatly around her shoulders, her knitting untouched in her lap. Inspector Cray returned just past 7, brushing sleet from his coat. His expression was unreadable at first, but there was a certain set to his jaw, one that Miss Marple recognized as the result of a confession received and justice set in motion. Petherick broke within the hour, he said, lowering himself into the chair beside the hearth. He didn't deny it, claimed he acted out of necessity, said the estate's funds were idle and that Eleanor wouldn't have wanted them to go to waste. But he admitted forging the withdrawals. As for placing the lighter, yes, he confessed that too. Said Denning's nonsense gave him the perfect cover. Griselda's hand trembled slightly in her husband's, but she said nothing. He even tried to justify it. Cray went on bitterly. Said no one would have missed the money, that the village had benefited more from his use of it than the manor ever had, as if benevolent theft is somehow less criminal. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. That's the danger of clever men with small consciences. They convince themselves they're the exception to the rules that hold the rest of us together. Cray looked at her with something like gratitude. You were right. About all of it. The lanterns, the diversions, the layers of guilt. Denning's trial will be a mess. But Petherick, he'll be disbarred, certainly, and likely imprisoned. He hesitated, then added, we also recovered the missing brooch. It had been sold to a pawnbroker under an alias and later bought back by Petherick. He feared it might reappear and tie him to Eleanor's final night. Griselda found her voice at last. And Eleanor? Will there be a proper service? Cray nodded. The coroner will release the remains within the week. Her family, what's left of it, has been notified. She'll be buried in the churchyard, beside her parents. There was silence, warm and sad, as the fire popped gently behind the grate. Miss Marple finally picked up her knitting. Then, in the end, It was not the flame that gave us answers, but what it illuminated: foolish pride, long-held secrets, and a young woman who deserved to be mourned honestly. Cray stood, his hat in hand. Thank you, Miss Marple. Without you, we'd still be chasing shadows. She looked up with a faint smile. Oh, but shadows can be quite helpful, Inspector. They only appear when something real stands in the light. And in the hush that followed, it seemed the village, too, exhaled.